Ike was a quiet man as politicians go, but he was a strong, hidden force who did great damage to the Republic. He was the creator of the corporate party that now rules the nation. The corporate party carves out the true Democrats and Republicans while combining the rhinos and dinos into the ruling class. Ike felt that the Republican and Democratic parties should only disagree on things of no consequence. Now, it's a completely disingenuous approach to politics because you're telling people that there are two parties when in reality there are not. Now, here are Stephen Ambrose's words. They reflect Ike's sentiments. His chief worry was the old guard, not Taft, whom he was beginning to admire, but McCarthy, Hickenlooper, Bricker, Bridges, Goldwater, and the others. The apparent hopelessness of working effectively with such men led Eisenhower to muse about the possibility that, quote, I should set quietly about the formation of a new party, close quote. That comes from Eisenhower, Volume 2, The President, by Stephen Ambrose. So, in Ike's mind, true conservatives were to be marginalized, while rhinos, that term did not exist in 1950, were to be consulted. Now, is it any surprise that Gerald Ford would take a shine to Ike? Not at all. Gerald Ford stood with men like Senator Prescott Bush as the quote-unquote center to be cultivated and consulted. The Republican Party was divided back then, as it is today, between two factions: the true conservatives, which were called the Old Guard, and the moderates. The true conservatives were men like McCarthy, Hickenlooper, Bricker, Bridges, Goldwater, Welker, and Jenner. Men like Nixon were more in the center of the Republican Party, not extremely right, but not exactly moderate. Nixon was distrusted somewhat by Ike and his associates because they felt he would side with the old guard if elected or compelled to assume the powers of the presidency. In fact, Nixon was only brought onto the ticket because he did tend to side with the old guard and could therefore attract their votes in 52 and 56. Nixon was strongly anti-communist. The same cannot be said for Eisenhower, despite his and his disciples' protestations. Indeed, Ike was dragged kicking and screaming into opposing the communists. Here's an example, again, from Eisenhower, Volume 2, The President, by Stephen E. Ambrose. In an effort to prove that McCarthy and his friends could trust Eisenhower to carry out the hunt for communists, Brownell, that would be Herbert Brownell, who was Ike's Attorney General, decided with Eisenhower's approval to go after Truman himself by reviving the case of Harry Dexter White. Back in 1946, ex-communists Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley had accused White, an official in the Treasury Department, of being a Russian spy. White denied it, and a federal grand jury refused to indict him. The FBI, however, had sent further evidence about White to Truman. Truman read the FBI report and decided it contained only the evidence offered by a crook and a louse, and that would be Chambers and Bentley. The only thing new was a charge that White had shown friendliness to Russia during the war. Truman dismissed the charges from his mind and indeed promoted White, who later died of a heart attack in 1948. Brownell looked through the record, evidently prodded by J. Edgar Hoover, and decided that Truman was wrong. Brownell felt the record showed White to be clearly guilty, and he could not understand how Truman could have promoted the man after reading the record. Brownell met with Eisenhower. He told the president the case was too important to cover up, that he felt a personal obligation to make it public, and that disclosure was justified political criticism, and that it would take away some of the glamour of the McCarthy stage play. Eisenhower told him to go ahead. Now, if you're confused about Ike's position regarding the Army McCarthy hearings, you need me. No one should have been more angry about espionage at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey than Dwight Eisenhower, yet he was not. You would think Dwight Eisenhower would be thankful to Joe McCarthy for pointing out such subversive activity at an army base. But if you thought that, you would be wrong. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower worked behind the scenes to destroy Joe McCarthy. Now, why would this be? Ike's apologists will tell you that McCarthy's efforts were hindering the fight against communism. The problem, though, was that there was no serious fight against communism here at home or even abroad. Joe McCarthy had remarked about George Marshall, Ike's buddy, that if his mistakes in fighting the communists had been random and innocent, we'd have a few battles go our way. McCarthy was insinuating that George Marshall's heart really wasn't in fighting communism. There was and is still a body of thought that Marshall's capitulation to the communists was intentional. The communists in those days in the United States weren't hippies sitting around in communes singing Joan Baez tunes. Those communists in the 30s, 40s, and 50s were battle-hardened, clear-thinking, middle-class people who took their orders from Moscow. They were engaging in active subversion of the American capitalist system. The Rosenbergs were just such people. They were regular people. Julius Rosenberg pilfered documents at Fort Monmouth and dutifully turned them over to his Soviet handlers. His brother-in-law, David Greenglass, worked at Los Alamos and stole secret documents there at the behest of the Rosenbergs. Of course, none of this mattered to the majority of the established press, except as McCarthy's accusations made good copy and sold newspapers. They were solidly and emotionally behind Ike. Men like Herb Bloch, Richard Rovere, Drew Pearson carried Ike's water and led the charge against McCarthy. C.D. Jackson and Emmett Hughes, Ike's speechwriters, came from Henry Luce's Time Life empire. Why? And for what purpose? Why was Joe McCarthy such a threat? Joe McCarthy himself must have wondered. He didn't have the benefit of 75 years of history that we do. What now seems clear is that Joe McCarthy's crime was pulling the curtain back on both Truman and Eisenhower. The obvious conclusion is that men like Ike and Truman were not interested in defeating communism. Rather, they needed communism in order to justify the military-industrial complex, the permanent standing U.S. Army around the world, and the Cold War, and our new out-of-control war economy. Ike's corporate supporters feasted off war. That was why Joe McCarthy had to be defeated then and now. Even today, Joe McCarthy is laid to waste for every sin that has befallen America. He had to be destroyed. He still has to be destroyed. Ike knew then what was at stake. Vanquish the communists? Forget about it. Now, isn't it funny today that we have politicians who go far beyond what Joe McCarthy ever did, and yet there is no censure at all? And that is because censure is for people who really upset the powers that be, the elite class that have an ulterior design for the United States of America. And it's high time that you knew that. Out.